The trial had ended, but the palace did not grow calmer. If anything, the air grew heavier. Ethan had survived what was meant to break him, and that survival had sent ripples through the empire. Some nobles whispered his name with reluctant respect. Others spat it like poison. Lyra stayed close to him, her visits more frequent, her words warmer. "They see you now," she told him softly one night as they walked in the palace gardens. "Not weak, not prey. They see fire." Ethan gave a weary smile. "Fire makes enemies too." She glanced at him, her eyes shimmering under the starlight. "Yes, but also allies. The storm approaches." It did not take long for the storm to break. Scouts brought news that rival houses were gathering their forces. To them, Lyra's claim over a human was not just scandal, it was weakness. They believed the royal line had lost its way and they meant to strike. The king summoned his generals. The council chambers shook with arguments, voices rising and falling like thunder. Ethan was not allowed inside, but he could hear enough. War was coming. That night, Lyra came to his chamber. Her steps were quick, her face pale with worry. "They will attack," she said. "Soon." Ethan's chest tightened. He had fought before, but never like this. Not at the heart of an empire. "And your father? What does he want me to do?" Her lips pressed thin. "He wants you hidden, kept away." Ethan almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "After all this, they still want me locked in a cage?" Lyra stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Not I. I want you with me, by my side." Her words sent a warmth through him, sharper than any fire. The siege began at dawn. The rival houses struck with speed, their forces darkening the horizon. Warships hovered above the city, their shadows falling across the crystal towers. The ground shook with the march of soldiers, banners snapping in the wind. The palace guards rushed to the walls, their weapons glowing as they prepared to defend. Inside, nobles screamed, demanding safety. The king barked orders, his voice booming, but even he could not hide the worry in his eyes. Ethan stood in the courtyard watching as the sky filled with fire. He had no armor, no alien weapon, but he refused to hide. Lyra joined him, clad in silver battle gear, her hair tied back, her eyes fierce. "You stay behind me," he said firmly. Her lips curved into a small smile. "No, human. Today, we fight together." The gates trembled as enemy forces pressed in. Then the palace exploded into chaos. The battle Ethan fought with nothing but courage and whatever he could grab from fallen soldiers. A spear, a broken shield, even a shard of crystal. Anything to hold back the tide. His body ached. His arms screamed with pain, but he did not stop. He fought not for the throne, not for the nobles, but for Lyra. Every step he took, he stayed close to her, shielding her from blades and arrows. When one warrior broke through and swung for her, Ethan threw himself in the way, taking the blow on his arm. Pain seared through him, but he stood firm. Lyra's eyes widened, and with a cry, she struck down the attacker. She caught Ethan's arm, steadying him. "Fool," she whispered, but her voice shook with something more than anger. The battle raged for hours. Fires burned across the palace, smoke rising into the sky. Ethan's vision blurred, but he refused to fall. Together, he and Lyra carved a path through the chaos, their bond unspoken but undeniable. At last, the enemy forces faltered. The king himself led the final charge, his voice booming across the courtyard. The palace guards rallied, pushing back the invaders. By nightfall, the rival houses were in retreat, their banners trampled in the dirt. The declaration, the survivors, gathered in the throne hall, battered but alive. The king sat heavily on his throne, his crown tilted, his face marked with battle. The queen leaned beside him, silent, her eyes calculating. The nobles waited, tense and restless. Some still glared. At Ethan, others avoided his gaze, but no one could deny what they had seen on the battlefield. Lyra stepped forward, pulling Ethan with her. Her voice rose, steady and strong. "You all saw. He fought. He bled. He stood when others fled. This human is not weakness. He is not shame. He is strength. Gasps echoed through the hall, but Lyra did not falter. She lifted Ethan's hand, holding it high. He is mine, not as possession, not as pet. Mine as equal. Mine as choice. The hall fell silent. The words hung heavy, in the air. Even the king did not speak. Ethan stood there, stunned, his heart pounding. He had never asked for this, never imagined it. Yet as he looked at Lyra, her eyes blazing with defiance and devotion, he knew the truth. He belonged here. At last, the king rose. His gaze swept over Ethan, then his daughter. Slowly, he nodded once. A gesture not of full approval, but of acknowledgement. The queen said nothing, but her eyes no longer burned with the same icy contempt. The nobles bowed, some reluctantly, some with true respect. The battle had changed more than the palace walls, it had changed the heart of the empire. The hall was still buzzing with shock. The princess's words echoed in every corner of the chamber, like a bell no one could unhear. The king's eyes narrowed, the queen's lips pressed into a thin line, and the nobles shifted restlessly, whispering among themselves. For a royal heir to claim anyone, especially a fragile outsider, was unthinkable. Ethan knelt on the floor, his hands bound, completely lost in translation. He didn't understand their language, but he could feel the tension pressing down on him. The princess had said something powerful, something dangerous. Every glance told him it was not small. The king finally spoke. His voice was deep, commanding, filled with authority. The sound rolled through the air, and though Ethan couldn't understand the words, he knew they were directed at the princess. The tone was sharp, questioning, even angry. But the princess stood tall. Her eyes didn't waver, her chin lifted with quiet pride. She answered with confidence, her words steady and firm. Ethan couldn't catch the meaning, but he understood her defiance. She was standing against her own family, against her king, and queen for him. The queen leaned forward, her voice cold as steel. Her hands gripped the arms of her throne, her stare slicing through Ethan like a blade. Ethan felt the weight of judgment. She did not want him there. He was certain of it. Still, the princess continued. Her voice rose louder, clearer, carrying across the chamber. At last, the room went silent again. The king gave a command. The guards pulled Ethan to his feet. He thought they would drag him away to a prison cell, but instead they led him toward the princess. She gestured firmly, insisting that he remain at her side. Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't know if this was good or bad, but he was still alive, and that was something. The nobles muttered furiously as Ethan was pulled beside her. Some pointed, some sneered, others shook their heads in disbelief. He caught glimpses of their expressions: anger, insult, fear. He wasn't welcome, not here, not in this grand court of crystal and stone. The king raised his hand, silencing them all. Then he leaned forward, speaking directly to his daughter. Ethan didn't need to know the words to understand the warning in the king's voice. He was giving her one chance to explain herself. The princess's eyes flickered toward Ethan. She placed a hand gently on her chest, then extended it toward him. The gesture was simple, but Ethan felt the meaning. She was connecting him to herself, claiming him, protecting him. The hall gasped again. The king leaned back slowly. His jaw tightened. Then, with a wave of his hand, he ended the gathering. The guards released Ethan's arms, though the cuffs remained. The nobles filed out, muttering as they left, their voices thick with resentment. When the chamber was nearly empty, the princess turned to Ethan. For the first time, she spoke directly to him in broken English. "You, safe, with me." Ethan blinked, stunned. She knew his language, at least enough to say this. Relief washed over him, though confusion quickly followed. "Safe?" he repeated. What do you mean by mine?" The princess tilted her head, struggling with the words. "Mine. Choice. I choose." Choose? Ethan's heart raced. Did she mean she chose to protect him, or something more? Before, he could ask. She turned away, her attendants surrounding her. She glanced back only once, her eyes locking with his for a brief moment. It was enough to silence his questions. The guards led Ethan away through twisting hallways, their spears always close to his back. He was taken to a chamber, a room far grander than any cell he expected. The walls were smooth crystal, glowing, faintly with light. A bed of silk-like fabric sat in the corner, along with a low table filled with fruits that shimmered like jewels. He stood there, bewildered, as the guards left him alone. For the first time since the crash, Ethan was free to breathe. He sat on the bed, running his hands across the strange fabric, and tried to make sense of it all. The princess had saved his life. But why? As he wondered, the door slid open. She entered. The princess moved gracefully, her silver gown whispering across the floor. She dismissed the attendants behind her, leaving only the two of them in the room. Ethan rose quickly, unsure of the proper gesture. Should he bow? Stand tall? Speak first? His mind spun. She studied him quietly for a moment. Then she stepped closer and spoke again, slowly, carefully. You, not prisoner. You, guest. Ethan swallowed. Guest? She nodded. Guest, my protection. The word struck him like a thunderclap. She was using her status, her power to shield him. In this alien court, where everyone else wanted him gone, she was the only one keeping him alive. Ethan's voice was rough, but sincere. Why? The princess paused, searching for words. Finally, she placed her hand over her chest again. Because... fire. He frowned. Fire? She touched his chest gently, over his heart. Here. Fire. Ethan froze, his heart pounding under her touch. He didn't fully understand, but he could see it in her eyes. She believed there was something inside him, something worth protecting. For the first time since the crash, Ethan felt a strange spark of hope. But outside the chamber, he could already hear the faint echoes of anger from the nobles. The princess might have claimed him, but the rest of the world was not ready to accept a human standing at her side. And Ethan knew his survival had only just begun. The days that followed were strange for Ethan. He was no longer chained like a prisoner, but neither was he free. The princess had given him a private chamber inside the palace, watched over by guards who never let him walk alone. Servants brought food and clothes, though their eyes carried distrust whenever they looked at him. Everywhere he went, whispers followed. Nobles in flowing robes paused their conversations when he passed. Palace workers bowed low before the princess, but stiffened when their gaze slid toward Ethan. He understood none of their words, but the tone was clear. They believed he did not belong. The princess, however, remained constant. Lyra, he had learned her name when she spoke it softly in broken English, visited him often. At first she struggled to find the words, but each day she practiced, slowly weaving human phrases with her alien tongue. You eat well? She would ask, her accent heavy but gentle. You safe? Ethan tried to answer simply, teaching her small words in return. In those moments he felt a fragile bond forming, like two threads being tied together across a great distance. But beyond their quiet exchanges, tension was building. The feast on the seventh night since his arrival, the royal family held a great feast. The hall was filled with nobles, warriors, and advisors. Tables stretched endlessly, covered with platters of glowing fruits, roasted meats from creatures Ethan had never seen, and goblets of liquid that shimmered like molten silver. The princess insisted that Ethan sit near her, close to the throne. This decision alone sent murmurs rippling across the hall. Many nobles avoided looking at him, but others glared openly, their disgust clear. Ethan sat stiffly, his hands resting on the table. He tried to focus on the food, though much of it looked strange. Lyra leaned toward him and whispered, Eat. Show respect. He nodded, carefully lifting a piece of fruit that glowed faintly green. The taste was sweet, almost like honey, and he gave her a small nod of approval. She smiled at his reaction, clearly pleased, but the hall did not stay peaceful for long. Noble from one of the rival houses rose to speak. His robes were dark, trimmed with gold, and his eyes glittered with disdain as they landed on Ethan. He raised his voice in the alien tongue, addressing the king and queen, though his gaze never left the human. The words rolled sharp and fast, filled with anger. Ethan didn't need a translator to know he was the subject. The noble gestured at him, sneering, his tone laced with venom. Others joined, nodding and murmuring agreement. The princess slammed her goblet down, the sound echoing through the chamber. She rose to her feet, her silver gown flowing as she pointed directly at Ethan. Her words rang clear, strong, her voice slicing through the noise. Though Ethan couldn't understand most of it, he caught a single phrase repeated again and again. My choice. The hall erupted. Some shouted in protest, others argued back, and the noise swelled like a storm. The king finally raised his hand, his voice booming with authority, silencing the crowd. The feast continued, but the tension remained thick. Ethan realized then that he was not just an unwelcome guest. He was a spark in a fire that threatened to burn the entire palace. The attempt. That night, after the feast ended, Ethan returned to his chamber under guard. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the glowing walls, his thoughts heavy. He had not asked for this. He had not chosen to be the princess's claim. Yet now, he was caught in a struggle larger than himself. Sleep came slowly. His mind replayed the glares of the nobles, the anger in their voices, the weight of Lyra's defiance. And then the silence broke. The door creaked open. Ethan stirred, half awake, until he saw a shadow slip into the room. The figure moved fast, dagger glinting faintly in the light. Ethan's body reacted before his mind could. He rolled off the bed as the blade slashed down where he had been lying. The intruder hissed, lunging again. Ethan grabbed the nearest object, a metal pitcher, and swung it hard. It struck the attacker's arm, knocking the dagger loose, but the assassin was stronger. They tackled Ethan to the ground, hands closing around his throat. Ethan gasped for breath, struggling wildly. Panic surged through him. He clawed at the attacker's grip, his vision blurring. The door burst open. Guards stormed in, weapons drawn. The assassin tried to flee, but one of the guards struck them down with a heavy blow. The body fell limp on the floor. Ethan lay gasping, his chest burning, his heart pounding. The guards dragged the body away, their faces grim. Moments later, the princess herself appeared, her expression fierce. She knelt beside Ethan, her hands hovering near his throat, her eyes filled with fear. "You hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head weakly. "Alive," he rasped. Relief flooded her face, followed quickly by anger. She stood, her voice rising as she commanded the guards. They bowed deeply and rushed out, carrying her orders into the night. When the chamber was quiet again, Lyra turned back to Ethan. She sat beside him, her hand brushing against his shoulder. They try take you, kill." Her voice was heavy with sorrow and rage. "But you fight. Fire." Ethan swallowed hard, the memory of the blade flashing before his eyes. He met her gaze and nodded. "I fight. But why? Why me?" The princess hesitated, then spoke softly. "Because you change everything." Her words hung in the air, heavy and mysterious. Ethan didn't fully understand, but deep down, he felt the truth in them. The palace grew colder after the attack on Ethan. Guards doubled at every corner and whispers thickened like smoke in the corridors. The nobles were furious that a human had survived the assassin's blade. Many muttered that fate itself had been bent against tradition. Ethan stayed in his chamber for days, restless but alert. He could feel the tension pressing against the walls. Whenever Lyra visited, she wore a heavy look, as though carrying the weight of the whole empire on her shoulders. She tried to hide it, but Ethan could see through her smiles. One evening she entered with a guarded expression. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw hesitation. "There will be trial," she said softly. Ethan frowned. "Trial? What kind of trial?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Counsel. Demand. They test you. If you fail—" Her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Ethan's chest tightened. "And if I pass?" Lyra's eyes burned with quiet hope. "Then they cannot deny. You stay." The council's decision. The next day, Ethan was summoned to the great council hall. It was larger than the throne room, with towering pillars carved into shapes of ancient warriors. Flames burned in tall braziers, casting shadows across the chamber. Dozens of nobles gathered, their robes heavy with jewels and symbols of power. At the center, the king sat on a high seat, the queen beside him, their expressions carved in stone. Lyra stood to the side, her hands clasped tightly. Ethan was brought forward, unarmed but unbound. The king's voice carried across the hall, slow and deliberate. Though Ethan didn't understand every word, Lyra had warned him what was coming. The council demanded proof. Proof that he was worthy to stand by her. Proof that he wasn't just a fragile outsider disrupting their ways. The trial of ancestry, they called it. A challenge designed for warriors of noble blood. No outsider had ever faced it. Lyra stepped forward, pleading, her voice sharp with emotion. She argued against the decision, but the council's response was louder, angrier. Finally, the king raised his hand, silencing them all. His judgment was final. Ethan would face the trial. The arena at dawn, Ethan was taken to the arena. It was a massive circle carved into stone, surrounded by high walls filled with onlookers. The crowd roared with anticipation, their voices echoing like thunder. Ethan stood in the center, the sand cool beneath his boots. Across from him, a great gate opened and a creature emerged. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, part beast, part machine. Its body was armored with plates of bone and steel, its eyes glowing with red fire. It snarled, shaking the ground as it stepped forward. Ethan's pulse raced. He had no weapon, no armor, only his instincts. The beast charged. Ethan dove aside, the creature's claws tearing into the sand where he had stood. He scrambled to his feet, searching for anything he could use. The arena was bare, designed to test will more than strength. The beast lunged again, jaws snapping. Ethan grabbed a broken spear from the ground, likely left from a past trial, and rolled beneath the monster's swipe. With all his strength, he jammed the spear upward, striking between the beast's armored plates. The creature roared, thrashing wildly. Ethan was thrown to the ground, his chest aching, but he didn't let go. He twisted the spear deeper, pushing until the beast collapsed with a final shudder. Silence fell over the arena. Then the crowd erupted in thunderous noise. Ethan lay gasping, his body bruised and trembling. But he had survived. The next test, he thought it was over, but the council had other plans. A second gate opened, revealing not a beast, but 3 armored warriors. They carried long spears crackling with energy. Ethan's heart sank. He was exhausted, his muscles screaming, but he forced himself to rise, gripping the broken spear tighter. The first warrior lunged. Ethan parried clumsily, sparks flying as the weapons clashed. He ducked, rolled, and jabbed at the warrior's legs, knocking him down. The second came from behind. Ethan spun, swinging wildly, the spear connecting with the warrior's helmet. The figure stumbled but didn't fall. The third warrior circled, patient, waiting for the moment Ethan faltered. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. His vision blurred. He knew he couldn't match their strength, but strength wasn't his only weapon. He feigned a stumble, luring the third warrior closer. At the last second, he drove the broken spear into the warrior's knee joint, sending him crashing down. The other 2 rushed him, but Ethan used the fallen body as a shield. Their spears struck harmlessly against their own comrade. With a desperate cry, Ethan knocked one out with a blow to the head and shoved the last against the wall. The crowd roared again, their voices a storm. Ethan dropped the broken spear, his arms trembling. He stood swaying, but he stood. The aftermath, when it was finally over, the king rose. His expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Ethan had survived. Against all odds, he had endured what no outsider was meant to face. Lyra rushed forward, her eyes shining with pride. She caught him before he could fall, steadying him with her strength. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "You showed them." The council murmured, divided between anger and reluctant respect. Some bowed their heads, unwilling to admit the truth. Others looked at Ethan with new eyes, not as prey, but as a man who had defied the impossible. But Ethan knew this was not the end. The trial had proven his worth, but it had also made him more dangerous in the eyes of those who wanted him gone. And deep in his heart, he wondered what new storm would rise from the fire he had lit. The shuttle shook like it was coming apart. Alarms screamed in Ethan's ears as sparks rained down from broken panels. His hands gripped the controls tightly, but the system was dead. Smoke filled the cabin, and through the cracked viewport, he saw a foreign sky. Purple clouds, sharp ridges of mountains, and a burning sun that glared like an eye. Ethan had survived crashes before. He was trained to handle emergencies, but this time was different. The planet was unknown, uncharted, and far from any beacon. He pressed his body back against the seat, bracing for impact. The shuttle roared as it hit the surface, bouncing across rough stone. Metal screamed as it tore apart, and then silence fell. When Ethan opened his eyes again, the world was tilted. The cockpit was half buried in dust and sand. His head throbbed and blood trickled from a cut near his temple. He pushed himself free from the harness and crawled toward the exit. The hatch refused to open. Gritting his teeth, he kicked it again and again until it gave way. Light poured in. The first breath of the alien air burned his lungs, but then he realized he could breathe. The sky stretched endlessly above him, a canvas of shifting colors that reminded him of oceans at sunset. Strange. Birds circled high, their wings shimmering like glass. For a brief moment, Ethan felt the beauty of it until he heard the sound. Boots. Heavy boots. He turned, and his stomach dropped. A line of armored figures was approaching. They were tall, taller than any human he had ever seen, wearing dark, silver armor engraved with symbols that glowed faintly. Their faces were hidden behind sharp masks, and long spears hummed with an energy he didn't recognize. Ethan raised his hands slowly. "I come in peace," he said, voice hoarse. But he doubted they understood. The soldiers closed in, their formation tight. One barked words in a tongue that sounded sharp and melodic. Ethan didn't move. His training told him to stay calm, to show no aggression. Yet when one of the warriors shoved him to his knees, he realized this was no rescue team. They bound his wrists with metallic cuffs that tightened on their own. The leader gave an order, and Ethan was dragged forward. His boots scraped the ground as they forced him to march. He wanted to resist, but he was outnumbered, unarmed, and still dizzy from the crash. After what felt like hours, they reached the city. It was unlike anything he had seen. Towers of crystal rose from the earth like frozen lightning. Bridges arched through the sky, and the streets shimmered with light from glowing stones. Creatures with scaled skin and feathered cloaks moved aside as the soldiers dragged Ethan through. He caught glimpses of marketplaces, children pointing at him, and whispers rising like wind. They were bringing him somewhere important. Finally, they reached the largest structure of all. A palace of white stone and blue crystal stood at the heart of the city. Its gates were wide enough for ships to pass through, guarded by statues of winged beasts. Ethan's chest tightened. This was not a trial by soldiers. This was judgment. Inside, the hall stretched endlessly. The floor was polished stone that reflected the light from a ceiling painted with stars. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Nobles in flowing robes, armored guards, and attendants holding banners. At the far end, a throne of silver and glass rose high, where a king and queen sat, their presence commanding silence. The soldiers threw Ethan to the ground. He fell hard, his knees slamming against the cold floor. He tried to rise, but the cuffs forced him down. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the royal family for the first time. The queen's gaze was sharp and cold, like ice. The king's expression was stern, unreadable. Murmurs rippled across the hall, words he couldn't understand but tones that carried clear meaning: disgust, curiosity, anger. And then she appeared, the princess. She stepped forward from beside the throne, her gown flowing like liquid silver. Her skin glowed faintly under the light, pale with a strange softness. Her hair was long, dark as night, with jeweled pins that sparkled with each movement. Her eyes, unlike the others, were curious, wide and bright, fixed on him with intensity. Ethan's breath caught. The guards forced him to bow, but the princess moved closer. She studied him like someone discovering a living myth. The hall quieted as her voice rang out, clear and strong. "He is mine." Gasps echoed everywhere. The king stiffened. The queen's lips parted in shock. Nobles whispered, some horrified, some scandalized. The soldiers looked uncertain, glancing at each other as if unsure of what to do. Ethan blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. He had no idea what she meant, but one thing was clear. Her words had changed everything. The hall fell silent again. All eyes locked on him and the princess who had claimed him, and Ethan realized his life was no longer his own.